Genesis 4 is the story of Cain and Abel. This chapter has been the subject of much interpretation. The Midrash in particular has much to say around Cain and Abel, but this is nowhere reflected in the biblical narrative which we have. I would of course urge you to read widely on the topic, but here I am going to stick to the biblical account as we have it. I'll start by saying that the God in chapter 4 is Yahweh. If you remember, Elohim was the God of chapter 1. Yahweh Elohim took over in chapters 2 and 3, and here we have Yahweh on his own. One more indication of the many hands that wrote the book of Genesis. Chapter 4 would itself appear to have been hashed together from a few different sources, as I think we shall see.
Chapter 4. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground.
We start without much backstory, and we're left to fill in the blanks, which of course gives preachers and apologists license to mould their lessons as they will. They are quite happy to lean on external ancient interpretations when these support the desired message, and just as quick to dismiss them when they might contradict their personally required interpretation. Verses 1 and 2 tell us very little, but it is reasonable to make some assumptions from them. Adam and Eve were kicked out of Eden, and they then started begatting as God had commanded them. We do not know how old they were when Cain and Abel were born, or how much older than Abel Cain was. We know from chapter 5 that Adam was 130 when Eve gave birth to Seth, but we do not know whether that was 130 years from when he was created, or if God took into account the age at which he created Adam when calculating his age for Moses to write down. We're left to guess, and we could guess that Adam and Eve were born as mature teenagers, ready to breed. It would not have been intelligent for God to design them any older than was necessary. He would simply have needed fully formed adult beings capable of reproducing, and would gain nothing by creating them as if they had been 30, 50 or 100 years old. So I'll assume then that they were both created with a developmental age of about 20. As a healthy couple with no access to birth control and undiminished reproduction, how many children would you expect them to have by the time they had Seth at the age of 130? There are countries in the world today with an average of 7 or more live births per woman. We know from history of countless cases of a dozen or more children in a family, and we know that a woman's fertility decreases with age and then stops with the menopause. We also know that Eve was still fertile at 130. So I leave it to you to consider how many children it would have been reasonable to expect her to have had. It is also safe for us to assume that Adam and Eve would have brought their kids up to fully understand the repercussions of disobeying their God. We can be certain that as Adam daily toiled to fight the thorns and thistles, which God had specifically created to thwart his attempts at growing food, and as Eve suffered the cramps of her monthly period and then the agony of childbirths, which God had specifically inflicted on her to punish her for scrumping an apple, their minds would have been constantly cast back to their previous idyllic life in Eden. And as anyone would, they must have continually looked for ways to return to the garden, to perhaps ingratiate themselves in their God's eyes. Offering sacrifices to God was a normal part of their lives. We're not told why they were making sacrifices. Was it to thank God for allowing them to be tricked by the snake, or for his kicking them out of Eden? Or perhaps for the lifelong pain and suffering that God had inflicted on them and their children because of their one innocent mistake. Or maybe they thought that by sacrificing, God might forgive them their innocent mistake and restore them to the garden. But whatever the reason, God, who had evidently developed a bloodlust, having become the first being to slaughter animals on earth when he provided Adam and Eve with their animal skins in Eden, now required that his apex creation regularly killed things and brought their bodies to him. You might ask what use the immaterial and all-powerful God had with these animals, which had been senselessly slaughtered in his name. We do learn elsewhere that God likes the smell of burning flesh, so perhaps it was as simple as that. But let's get back to Cain and Abel.
And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof.
Now, we don't know how old Cain and Abel were when the events took place. We are told that Abel kept sheep and Cain grew crops. We're not told who looked after the cattle, goats and dinosaurs, or who was responsible for blacksmithing, building, weaving, baking, etc. We are simply told that Cain and Abel brought offerings to God. So Abel killed some sheep and presented this blood sacrifice to God. Cain also presented God with an offering of the produce of his toil.
And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect.
The apologists then argue that this was Cain snubbing God, because God demanded something had to bleed to death for his worship, and that Cain offering a sacrifice which had not been slaughtered just wasn't good enough. There is no explicit evidence in the text that Cain had done anything wrong by not offering a blood sacrifice.
And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him.
But we must assume that Cain did do something wrong. But why? Why would someone who knew God intimately ever consider doing something wrong? If we assume that Cain and Abel are at least in their late teens, and that these sacrifices had been taking place since Adam and Eve had been kicked out of Eden, then Cain and Abel would have been well aware of what God expected in the way of offerings, having had it drummed into them by their parents from day one. And Cain, knowing God himself, later he will chat to God as if it's no biggie, Cain would surely not take the risk of shortchanging his creator. All the Bible tells us is that God patted Abel on the back for his ritual slaughtering and snubbed his nose at Cain's 5-a-day offering. There is no real explanation as to why God did this, but maybe Cain did get sloppy. After all, his father had been created in God's image, his mother was a genetic clone of his father, though somehow female, and Cain was therefore a perfect genetic clone of his father as well. So though having himself been created in God's image, Cain still somehow fell foul of his creator. Being omniscient, of course, God knew precisely what the outcome of his snubbing of Cain's offering would be.
And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him.
Yet he decided that was his best course of action. Well, God knew that in a few generations he was going to wipe the whole of humanity off the face of the earth and erase Cain's lineage from history, so perhaps a little snubbing didn't seem such a big thing to God, who obviously did not value Abel's life enough to intervene, either by not snubbing Cain in the first place, or by staying Cain's hand when he lifted it to strike Abel. God works in mysterious ways, and often not at all. So God snubs Cain, and Cain then kills Abel, apparently in a calculated plot born of jealousy, though this is not explained in the biblical text whatsoever, and we have no backstory which really explains the motive. If the only people on earth were Adam, Eve, Cain and Abel, and occasionally apparently God, why would Cain be jealous of Abel? Unless God had deliberately played the part of agent provocateur. First, God had allowed the snake into the garden, then stood idly by and watched whilst it tricked the innocent Eve into eating the apple. Now he goes a step further, deliberately favouring Abel over Cain, knowing this will make Cain jealous, with absolute foreknowledge of the consequences of that course of action, and watching omnisciently as Cain bludgeons the presumably innocent Abel to a slow, painful death, just as God always knew that he would.
And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth.
God decides not to sentence Cain to death for the murder. Instead, he tells Cain that he will no longer be successful in working the land.
And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me.
Cain then complains that every single person on earth, that would be his mother and father then, will kill him if they find him. Well, he would certainly have some explaining to do, but parents can be quite forgiving, and having lost one son, they would probably think twice before killing their remaining son with their own hands, don't you think?
And the Lord said unto him, Therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him.
But God reassures Cain by telling him that if anyone does kill him, they themselves will be killed 7 times. And then God gives Cain a mark, presumably so that if his mother and father do find him, they will know that he, the only other human being on the earth whom they have stumbled upon, is indeed their son, because without the mark, how would they ever know?
And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch.
So Cain wandered off, and then he and his wife had a son. What? His wife? Well, we know that daughters don't often get mentioned in the begatting, so Cain obviously married his sister. The religious will tell you that this was fine because Adam and Eve's genetics were pure, which we must assume means that they have no problem with incest today, provided both parties undertake genetic screening beforehand. So anyway, Cain kills his brother, and God curses his farm as a result. Cain goes back to his sister, who knows that he has just killed her brother because God has tattooed him. His sister shrugs off the fact that Cain has become the first murderer in history and that she's just lost her brother, and she says goodbye to Mum and Dad, tells them that she's leaving the farm and going off to wander in the wastelands with her murdering husband, never to see them again, and everyone is fine with that. Now Cain and his sister have a child, and Cain then builds a city for the 3 of them to live in. Not a house, a city.
And unto Enoch was born Ired. And Ired begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives, the name of one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Neamah.
And then we have a Toledot, another list of generations. And we are told that Jabal is the father of all those who live in tents and raise cattle. Jabal is the father of all the musicians, and Tubal is the father of all the metalworkers. Which is pure nonsense, of course, because all of Cain's offspring will be wiped out a couple of pages later in the flood. Just one more biblical inconsistency. So, having had the bizarre story of Cain and Abel, followed by the meaningless Toledot, meaningless because it's obviously intended to explain the origins of certain crafts and artisans, but is rendered meaningless almost immediately by the deluge which erases Cain's genetic line from history, we now have this absurd little poem.
And Lamech said unto his wives Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 70 and 7-fold.
Which I am certain had deep significance to those that wrote it down, but appears to have been shoehorned into this genealogy. And had Lamech killed 1 or possibly 2 men, as detailed here, who were they? We are still at a stage where everyone on earth could be on first-name terms, yet there is no mention of anyone apart from Abel being killed.
And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord.
I will be going into Cain's genealogy and comparing it to Seth's in the next chapter. So, what do we really learn from chapter 4? Hidden therein appear to be a couple of very old stories, one representing the struggle between the old lifestyle of the hunter-gatherer and the developing lifestyle of settled agriculture. There's the time-honoured tradition of sibling rivalry, and an obvious mythology about the origins of crafts and technology. On top of these, Yahweh appears to have been clumsily hammered into place for religious purposes. So, Everyone knows the story of Cain and Abel, but I wonder if everyone has read it and still thinks it makes any sense. Please comment, vote, subscribe and send burnt offerings. Thanks for watching.